I've been developing React applications for more than 5 years now, but most of this time I didn't really have a strong mental model about its rendering process. So it's sort of like driving a car. You don't necessarily need to understand how it works in order to be able to drive it. But if you do understand how the car works, you can be a better driver. And if you have a solid mental model about React rendering process, you can write a better code. If I look at my code from 3 years ago, my number one misconception about React rendering was that it renders when the properties change, which is absolutely not what happens in reality. So when does React render? Apart from initial render, React renders only when state changes through the call to setState from useStateHook or dispatch from useReducer. In a modern React world, those two things are the only triggers for the React rendering. So let's take a look at this very contrived example of an application that has two components, a button and a badge. So apart from the initial render, any of these components will render only if setState or dispatch is called inside of them. But then there is another extremely important rule. If the component renders, React will always render all the descendants of that component. Meaning that if app will render, badge and button will always render as well. So here this component, the app component that has a useStateHook, that has badge component and button component inside as its descendants or like its children. And clicks and setClicks from the useStateHook is then passed to a button. So when the button is clicked, setState from that hook will be called and a new state will be produced inside the app. And because app will render, badge and button will render as well. So here we click the button and we see that the app rendered, badge rendered, and button rendered as well. In this case, when the button is clicked, it renders twice because the application is in the development mode. In the development mode, React renders everything twice. So 3 years ago, I would be thinking that button renders because it clicks count or set count properties have changed. But in reality, it's not because the properties have changed, but because its app renders, and because app renders, all its descendants renders as well, all the time. And the reason for it, because React doesn't know if any of the descendants actually changed. So just in case, it will re-render all of them. And when we talk about rendering, React rendering happens in two phases, rendering phase and commit phase. And during rendering, there are two things that happen. React renders the component that registered the state change and all its descendants, meaning that it calls those functions and gets their JS. And then it does a second thing called reconciliation, when it compares produced piece of virtual DOM with the existing virtual DOM, and if there are any changes, then they are scheduled to be committed and be converted to the actual DOM. Another important factor is that React tries to batch all the calls to the setState or dispatch. So for example, here we have two useStateHooks, and on a button click, we increment each one of them by 1. So what will happen is that React will batch them into one rendering phase. So now, even though we call two different setStates on two different useStateHooks, if we click the button, it still renders the same amount of times as before, even though two pieces of state kind of changed. But as soon as we introduce something like useEffect that will be listening to one of those states to change and then trigger change of another state, React will render in two different rendering phases. So now clicking button renders everything 4 times, again because of the debug mode. But rendering this batch component is unnecessary because it never changes. So re-rendering it every time the app renders is a waste of computational resources. Of course, it's an extremely simple example, but in the real world, some big complicated application, that could be a problem. So one thing possible to do is to reorganize how we handle state in this application. So now, of course, clicking button re-renders button itself, app doesn't re-render anymore, and batch doesn't render anymore, because now it button that renders, because this is where the state is changed, and so all the descendants of the button. Another thing we can do is to wrap a component using memo function. Memo function will essentially prevent this component from rendering when parent renders. So when the app will render, batch will not render. It will re-render only when the properties of that batch changes. So that's probably the second place where this myth about React re-rendering when the property changes could come from. But in reality, this is simply how memoization works. Because when we talk about memoization, we talk about dealing with the pure functions. And with the pure functions, we know that given the same arguments, we will receive always the same result. So we don't need to recompute that function if the arguments do not change. In case of React, since component is a function, its properties are arguments. So until properties change, React will reuse previously rendered memoized component. So now state is back at the app level, but clicking button renders only application and button, but doesn't re-renders batch. The downside though, that batch could have its own descendants. And those descendants, even though we potentially might want them to re-render, they're not going to be re-rendered as well until the batch will be re-rendered because its properties changed and new memoized version of the batch is created. So here batch has datetime component that shows current date and time. It rendered first time, but whenever I click the button, the datetime component doesn't re-render because batch wrapped in memo blocks its re-rendering. If on the other hand, datetime component will receive datetime as a property, which will then come from the batch element, which will come from the app. Now, whenever the button renders, app renders as well, and new property potentially passed into the batch and then datetime component. So I have said that React will re-render your component only if new state is created through setState or dispatch call. But truth is there are extra two use cases. First of them is state observed through new useSyncExternalStore hook is changed. So given the same example, an app component with a button and a batch, and inside the batch we have a datetime component. And a datetime component observes some external state through useSyncExternalStore hook. In this case, it's just an interval that every second create a new datetime snapshot. As we can see here, app rendered only one time, batch rendered only one time, button rendered only one time, but the datetime now rendered more than 200 times. And even more, batch is even wrapped using memo. So now if the button is clicked many times and the app renders, it doesn't affect the batch and it doesn't affect datetime. And datetime doesn't suffer from being problem of batch being memoized, like been shown before, because it directly reads that state. And the second sort of like exception is usage of context. Here the application is slightly restructured. So the whole application is wrapped with mood context provider. So any of those components can get access to the value provided by mood context through useContext hook. So here we have a mood context provider component that wraps the whole application. Then application will re-render whenever the button is clicked. Button on every even click will change the context value. Batch is memoized, meaning that it will render only once when the whole application rendered first time. And then mood avatar component will re-render every time mood context value changes, because it sort of like listens to that value or reads this value through this useContext hook. So now when the button is clicked, first time nothing has happened, app re-rendered, button re-rendered, but batch and mood avatar have not been re-rendered. When the button clicked second time, mood avatar been rendered, while batch stays memoized. So to summarize the mental model discussed today, React will render the components only during the initial render and only when the setState or dispatch is called inside the component. When the React renders that component, it will re-render all descendants of that component. We can wrap a component with memo function to prevent it from re-rendering until its properties change. But memoizing a component will effectively memoize all its descendants as well. So memoized component will block re-rendering all its descendants even if they want to re-render. So two extra reasons for React to re-render would be when the state provided through React context has changed, or when the state observed through useSyncExternalStore hook is changed, those will be 2 extra reasons for React to render a component. Even that component inside the memoized section of the application, React 19 though will bring React compiler, and one could ask why I decided to share my mental model about React rendering now, when all this memo, use callback, use memo, and all of that will be sort of like obsolete. The answer to that is, it's again like driving a car analogy. Driving a car with automatic transmission is a lot easier than driving a car with a mechanical transmission. But I know a lot of people who love using mechanical transmission, or who can use both, meaning they can drive any car and not only the ones that use automatic transmission. So React compiler is like this automatic transmission. It will help write React easier, but it doesn't mean you don't need to understand how React rendering works. Thank you for watching, and until the next time.